The precinct clock clicked over to 10:14 p.m. I remember the time because the man across the table, Richard Hayes, was busy wiping sweat off his forehead with handcuffed hands. But at that exact moment, 5 miles away, his wife placed the receiver back on the hook, convinced she'd just finished speaking to him. I would have called her hysterical, except for one thing. The telephone exchange logs confirmed the call came from his private line. He was in my custody, yet his voice was on the wire. Impossible? That's what I thought, too. It was November 1982, Seattle, the kind of November that feels less like a month and more like a sentence. The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days, turning the city into a blurred watercolor painting of gray concrete and smeared neon. I was sitting in interrogation room B, a box of a room that smelled of stale tobacco and damp wool. Across from me sat Richard Hayes. He wasn't a career criminal. He was an actuary, a man who spent his life calculating risks and ensuring columns added up. He was small, balding, with thick glasses that kept sliding down a nose slick with nervous sweat. We had picked him up at 8 p.m. on suspicion of embezzlement. A substantial amount of money had vanished from his firm, and all the digital footprints led to his terminal. He was terrified. He'd been crying for the first hour, trembling so hard his handcuffs rattled against the metal table. By 10:14 p.m., the moment the world tilted on its axis, Richard was exhausted. He was slumped in his chair, head in his hands, begging for a glass of water. I was just about to get up and fetch him one when the heavy metal door creaked open. It was Sergeant Miller. Miller was a good cop, steady as a rock, not the type to interrupt a session unless the building was on fire, but tonight he looked pale. He beckoned me into the hallway. "Jack," he whispered, his voice low. "You need to take this call on line 2. It's Hayes's wife." I frowned. "Tell her he's in custody. She can call a lawyer." "I did," Miller said. He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "She says she just got off the phone with him." I looked back through the one-way glass. Richard was still there, head down, motionless. He hadn't left that chair in 2 hours. "She's confused," I said. "She's not confused, Jack. She's terrified. She says he sounded wrong. Stay with me until the end. The truth behind this case still unsettles me." I walked over to the desk sergeant station. The station was quiet, just the low hum of the dispatch radio and the relentless drumming of rain against the high windows. I picked up the receiver. "Mrs. Hayes, this is Detective Harlan." Her voice was trembling, high-pitched and brittle. "Detective, you have to help me. Richard just called. He said he was at the office. He said he was in trouble." "Mrs. Hayes, listen to me carefully," I said, keeping my voice level. "Richard is here. He's been here since 8 o'clock. He hasn't been near a phone." "No," she cried. "I know his voice. We've been married 20 years. He called me at 10:14. I looked at the clock on the nightstand because the ring woke me up. He whispered. He said, 'Elena, don't trust the police. The ledger is behind the ventilation grate.' Then he hung up. A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the drafty hallway. The detail was too specific. We were looking for a ledger. Richard had denied knowing where it was all night. Before I tell you what happened next, please consider subscribing. It truly helps keep these stories alive. I looked at Miller. "Get the exchange on the line. Now." While Miller dialed the operator to trace the call history, I went back into the interrogation room. Richard looked up, his eyes red-rimmed behind those thick lenses. "Did you make a call, Richard?" I asked. He looked at me like I was insane. He held up his cuffed hands. With what? My mind? He was right. There was no phone in the room. I had been with him the entire time, except for the 30 seconds I stood in the hallway. What would you have done in my place? Would you trust the hysterical wife on the phone or the locked room in front of you? Miller knocked on the glass. I stepped out again. He held a piece of paper, his hand shaking slightly. Pacific Northwest Bell confirms it, Miller said. A call was placed at 10:14 p.m., duration 35 seconds. Origin, the private office of Richard Hayes downtown. I stared at the paper. It was a physical impossibility. Richard was here. His office was 5 miles away across a rain-soaked city. Is there anyone else who has access to his office? I asked. He says he has the only key, Miller replied. And security at his building logs everyone in. The building is empty, Jack. The night watchman says nobody has gone up to the 12th floor since Richard left at 6 p.m. I lit a cigarette. I didn't really want one, but I needed the moment to think. The smoke curled up into the fluorescent lights, gray against the harsh white. Check his personal effects, I ordered. We walked to the property locker. Bag FUPS 402, Richard's wallet, his watch, his spectacles case, and his keys. I picked up the key ring. Miller, I said, drive to the Hayes residence. Sit with the wife. If that phone rings again, I want you to answer it. Where are you going? Miller asked. I'm going to his office. I grabbed my trench coat. The contradiction was itching under my skin. A man cannot be in two places at once. It is the first rule of physics and the first rule of policing. If the phone company says a call came from his office, someone was in his office. And if that someone sounded like Richard Hayes, we had an impersonator, a very good one. If you were the detective, would you assume it was a recording? Or something more sinister? I drove through the city. The wipers slapped rhythmically against the windshield. Thwack, hiss. Thwack, hiss. The streets were empty, slick black ribbons reflecting the street lights. Every shadow looked a little deeper than usual. My mind raced. The wife mentioned a ledger behind a ventilation grate. If the caller was an impersonator, why give away the location of the evidence? That would only help us convict Richard, unless the caller wasn't trying to help Richard. I pulled up to the Glencoe building. It was a 12-story monolith of brick and dark windows. The rain was coming down harder now, a vertical sheet of water. The night watchman, a guy named Olds, met me at the door. He looked bored and tired. Nobody's been up there, Detective, Olds said, unlocking the glass doors. I've been at this desk since 6. Elevators haven't moved. I need to see the logbook, I said. He spun the book around. The last entry was R. Hayes. Out, 6:05 p.m. No entries after that. Is there a back way? Fire stairs only open from the inside. Alarmed, Olds grunted. Let's go up. The elevator ride was slow. The mechanical hum of the lift felt loud in the silence of the building. When the doors slid open on the 12th floor, the hallway was pitch black. I clicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stale air. The hallway was long, lined with frosted glass doors. At the far end, the name R. Hayes was stenciled in black letters. I approached the door. I had Richard's keys in my pocket, the ones taken from him at the station. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy clunk. The door swung open. The office was empty. My flashlight swept across the room. A mahogany desk, a leather chair, a wall of filing cabinets, and there, on the desk, sat the telephone. It was a black rotary model. The receiver was resting in its cradle. It looked innocent, Ordinary. I walked over to it. I placed my hand on the receiver. It was warm. Not room temperature. Warm. As if a hand had been holding it just moments ago. I swung the flashlight beam around the room, my hand dropping to the service revolver at my hip. "Police!" I shouted. My voice echoed flatly against the walls. Silence. Then I saw it. The rain was lashing against the office window, but the window was open a crack. A small puddle of water had formed on the carpet sill. I moved to the window and looked out. 12 stories down to the alley. No fire escape on this side. Just a sheer drop. I turned back to the room. If nobody came in through the door and nobody came in through the window, how did the phone get used? And then, the phone on the desk rang. The phone rang a second time. A shrill, mechanical trill that seemed to vibrate through the mahogany desk and straight into my bones. I stared at it. Ring. Common sense told me not to answer. Common sense told me to dust for prints. Call in. Forensics and treat this like a crime scene. But curiosity is a detective's occupational hazard. I picked up the receiver and held it to my ear, saying nothing. I just listened. For 3 seconds, there was only the sound of static, a hollow, open-line hiss. Then, a voice spoke. "You're looking in the wrong place, detective." My grip tightened on the plastic. It was the same voice. Richard Hayes. The same pitch. The same nasal quality I had heard in the interrogation room an hour ago. But there was a difference. The Richard in my custody was a stammering wreck. The voice on the phone was cold, precise, controlled. "Who is this?" I demanded. "Go home, Jack. Before the rain washes away something you can't replace." Click. The line went dead. I stood there in the dark office, the dial tone humming in my ear. He knew my name. Not just detective, but Jack. I slammed the receiver down. I immediately checked the ventilation grate the wife had mentioned. I pulled a letter opener from the desk and pried the cover loose. It clattered onto the floor. I shone my flashlight inside. Empty, just a thick layer of gray dust. But there was a rectangular, clean spot in the dust. A ledger had been there. Recently, someone had removed it. What would you have done in my place? Would you assume Richard Hayes was a mastermind running a crew from his cell, or that he was being set up by someone who could mimic him perfectly? I left the office and took the stairs down, bypassing the slow elevator. I needed to move. My footsteps echoed on the concrete stairs, a lonely, rhythmic clatter. At the front desk, Olds the watchman was reading a comic book. He jumped when I slammed my hand on the counter. "Who else is in the building, Olds?" "Nobody, swear to God," he stammered, spilling coffee on his uniform. "You said you were here since 6. Did you leave this desk, even for a minute?" He looked down, his face reddening. I went to the loading dock for a smoke around 10. Just 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Enough time for someone to slip in, go up, make the call, take the ledger, and slip out? It was tight, but possible. But it didn't explain the voice. Unless the intruder was a mimic. Or a relative. I drove back to the precinct. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, hammering the roof of my unmarked sedan. The city felt hostile tonight. Every pair of headlights in my rearview mirror looked suspicious. When I got back to the station, Miller was waiting for me. He looked shaken. "Jack, you're not gonna believe this," Miller said, handing me a coffee that was more sugar than bean. I sat with the wife. The phone didn't ring again, but she told me something else. She said Richard has a brother. I stopped mid-sip. "A brother? He didn't mention a brother." "A twin," Miller said. Estranged. She hasn't seen him in 15 years. Name's Arthur. Bad egg. Drifter. Con man. She thinks he's dead. A twin. It was the oldest trick in the book, almost insulting in its simplicity, but it fit the facts. A twin could have Richard's voice. A twin could have his face. I went back into the interrogation room. Richard was asleep, head on the table. I shook him awake. "Why didn't you tell me about Arthur?" I asked. Richard blinked, confused, then his face paled. "Arthur? Arthur is dead. He died in a car wreck in '78. Did you identify the body?" "No," Richard whispered. "It was a closed casket. My business partner handled the arrangements. Marcus Thorne." The name landed heavy in the room. Marcus Thorne. I knew the name. Everyone in Seattle knew the name. Thorne wasn't just an actuary. He was a power broker. He owned half the waterfront. If Richard was the numbers guy, Thorne was the muscle and the handshake. If you were leading this investigation, would you focus on the dead twin? Or would you start looking at the powerful business partner? I left Richard in the cell and went to find a payphone. I didn't trust the station lines anymore. Not after that call in the office. I dialed a contact of mine in the records department. It was 2 a.m., but I knew he'd be awake. "Run a check on Arthur Hayes," I said, "and cross-reference it with Marcus Thorne." Then, against protocol, I decided to pay Marcus Thorne a visit. Thorne lived in the Highlands, a gated community where the houses looked like fortresses and the driveways were heated. I pulled up to the gate, flashed my badge to a private security guard who looked like he ate bricks for breakfast, and drove up the winding path. Thorne's house was dark, except for a single light in the study. I knocked. Thorne opened the door himself. He was wearing a silk robe, holding a tumbler of scotch. He was a big man, silver-haired, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He didn't look surprised to see me. "Detective Harlan," he said, his voice a smooth baritone. "I assume this is about poor Richard." "It's about Arthur," I said. Thorne's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went flat. He stepped back. "Come in. It's wet out there." The house smelled of expensive leather and old money. We sat in his study. The rain lashed against the French doors. "Arthur Hayes is dead," Thorne said, pouring me a drink I didn't touch. I identified him myself. "Richard says it was a closed casket. It was a high-speed collision, detective. Fire. There wasn't much left to identify, but we found his ID. His dental records matched." "Did they?" I asked, leaning forward. "Or did you just tell the coroner they did?" Thorne took a slow sip of his scotch. "Careful, Jack. That sounds like an accusation. Someone was in Richard's office tonight. Someone who sounds like him. Someone who knew where the ledger was hidden." Thorne chuckled. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Richard is a paranoid, schizophrenic detective. He hides things. He hears voices. He probably hired someone to move his books before you arrested him. He's smarter than he looks." "And the voice on the phone? The one that threatened me?" Thorne set his glass down. "Maybe you're hearing voices too, Jack. It's a stressful job." I stood up. My instincts were screaming. This man was too calm. He had an answer for everything, but he was holding back. He hadn't asked what the voice said. He hadn't asked about the ledger. He knew. "I'll be seeing you, Thorne," I said. "I'm sure you will." I walked out into the rain. I got into my car and turned the key. The engine sputtered. It turned over, but it sounded rough. As I drove down the winding hill, I checked my rearview mirror. A pair of headlights flicked on behind me. A black sedan, no plates. I took a sharp right. The car followed. I sped up. The car matched my speed. My heart rate climbed. I reached for the radio to call it in to tell dispatch I was being tailed. But the radio was dead. Not just static, dead silence. The wires had been cut. I looked at the passenger seat. There was a small folded piece of paper sitting there. I hadn't seen it when I got in because it was dark. I snatched it up as I swerved around a corner, the tires screeching on the wet asphalt. I unfolded it with one hand. It was a photocopy of a birth certificate. Arthur Hayes, and scrawled across it in red ink were 3 words: "Let it ring." That was the moment. After this, there was no turning back for me. I wasn't just investigating an embezzlement case anymore. I was being hunted. And whoever was hunting me had been inside my locked car while I was talking to Thorne. The headlights behind me surged forward. They weren't just following me now. They were trying to run me off the road. The black sedan slammed into my rear bumper, metal screeching against metal. My head snapped back against the headrest. I fought the wheel, the tires of my Ford struggling for grip on the rain-slicked curves of the highlands. This wasn't a warning anymore. They were trying to kill me. I looked in the rearview mirror. The sedan's headlights were blinding, 2 burning eyes in the storm. I didn't have a radio to call for backup. I didn't have a partner. I just had a heavy car, 30 years of driving experience, and a gut full of fear. I saw a sharp turn coming up, a narrow service road used by maintenance trucks. It was unlit, hidden by a curtain of overgrown pine trees. I killed my headlights. What would you have done? Would you keep running or try to hide in the dark with a killer on your tail? I jerked the wheel hard to the right. The car fishtailed, mud spraying up the wheel wells before the tires bit into the gravel. I skidded to a halt behind a dense thicket of firs. I held my breath, my hand gripping my revolver. The black sedan roared past on the main road, its engine whining as it sped downhill, chasing a ghost. I waited 5 minutes. The only sound was the rain drumming on the roof and the ticking of my cooling engine. My hands were shaking. I lit a cigarette to steady them. The flame of the lighter illuminated the note, the passenger seat again. Let it ring. It wasn't a threat. It was an instruction. I needed to talk to the one person I had dismissed too early, the wife, Elena Hayes. I drove back into the city, taking back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main avenues where Thorne's men might be watching. The city felt different now. The neon signs for bars and motels reflected in the puddles looked like distorted monsters. The safety of the badge felt like an illusion. I parked a block away from the Hayes residence. The house was a modest bungalow, dark except for the blue flicker of a television in the living room. I knocked on the door. Elena answered, wrapped in a bathrobe, holding a glass of wine. Her eyes were puffy. When she saw me, wet, disheveled, mud on my trench coat, she didn't look surprised. She looked resigned. "He's not coming home, is he?" she asked quietly. "We need to talk about Arthur," I said. She froze. The door started to close, but I put my boot in the jamb. "Mrs. Hayes, someone just tried to run me off the road. I believe your husband is in danger, real danger. If you want him to live through the night, let me in." She hesitated, then stepped back. The living room smelled of lavender and stale fear. I sat on the edge of the sofa. "You told Sergeant Miller that Arthur was a bad egg," I said, "a drifter. but Thorne told me Arthur died in 78. Who is lying? Elena sat down, clutching her wine glass with both hands. She looked at the blank TV screen. Arthur isn't dead, she whispered. Thorne. Thorne made him disappear. Thorne uses people, Detective. He finds their weak spots and he presses until they break. And Richard? Richard was the weak spot, she said, her voice bitter. Richard is a genius with numbers, but he's a coward. Thorne owned him. Thorne made him cook the books for years, but last week, Richard found something. He found a way out. He stole the ledger to use as leverage. So Richard is the one in my cell, I said, and Arthur is the one calling him? Elena laughed. It was a broken, jagged sound. She looked at me, and for the first time I saw the depth of her exhaustion. Detective, think about the man in your cell. You said he was crying. You said he was terrified. Yes, Richard doesn't cry. Richard calculates. Richard hasn't cried since we buried our son 10 years ago. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Then who is in my cell? I asked, though the answer was already forming in the back of my mind, cold and heavy. Arthur, she said. Thorne found Arthur. He dragged him back from wherever he was hiding. He threatened to kill me if they didn't switch. Arthur took Richard's place in the cell to buy Richard time. Richard is the one on the outside. Richard is the one trying to disappear with the money. I stood up, the room spinning slightly. It explained everything. The man in the cell, the glasses kept sliding down his nose, because they weren't his prescription. The man in the cell was sweating, shaking, hysterical, because he was an imposter waiting to be found out. The voice on the phone, cold, precise, controlled. That was the real Richard. The impossibility of the phone call wasn't a paradox. It was a distraction. While we were marveling at the mystery of a voice in two places, the real criminal was running free, and the man in the cell was a sacrificial lamb. Where is Richard going? I asked. I don't know, Elena sobbed. He just said. He said he had to finish the equation. I ran back to my car. I had to get back to the station. If Thorne knew I was onto the switch, Arthur Hayes, the man in the cell, was a loose end, and Marcus. Thorne cleaned up loose ends. I drove fast, ignoring the speed limits. The rain was blinding now, a solid gray wall. I pulled up to the precinct. I didn't use the main entrance. I used the loading dock door. I moved through the quiet back hallways, my footsteps silent on the linoleum. I reached the observation room for interrogation B. I looked through the one-way glass. The chair was empty. My heart hammered against my ribs. I burst into the interrogation room. The handcuffs were still on the table, unlocked. A styrofoam cup of water had been knocked over, spilling a puddle onto the floor. Miller walked in behind me. He looked pale, holding a clipboard. Jack, where have you been? Internal Affairs has been looking for you. Where is the prisoner, Miller? I barked. Bailed out, Miller said, confused. His lawyer showed up 20 minutes ago. Posted bond, cash, a guy named Thorne? I felt a sick pit open in my stomach. I was too late. Thorne had retrieved his pawn. Did he say anything? I grabbed Miller by the lapels. Did the prisoner say anything before he left? Miller looked scared. Jack, calm down. Yeah, he said something weird. He looked right at the mirror like he knew you'd be watching. He said, "The equation ends at the docks." The docks. Thorne's territory. If you were me, would you go to the docks alone, knowing it was a trap? Or would you walk away and let the case remain a mystery? I let go of Miller. I knew I should call for backup. I knew I should explain the twins, the switch, the frame-up. But if I did, Thorne's lawyers would bury it in paperwork for years. By morning, Arthur and Richard would both be at the bottom of the Sound. I checked my revolver. 6 rounds. "Jack, don't do it," Miller warned, seeing the look in my eyes. "You're suspended. If you go out there, you're a civilian." "I'm not a civilian, Miller," I said, turning up the collar of my trench coat. "I'm the guy who answers the phone." I walked out into the storm. The final act was waiting for me at Pier 59, where the dark water met the darker sky. Pier 59 was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and rotting wood. The rain here didn't just fall, it was driven sideways by the wind coming off the Puget Sound, stinging my face like icy needles. The smell was distinct: diesel fuel, dead fish, and the metallic tang of ozone. I parked the sedan behind a stack of crates and moved on foot. My revolver felt heavy in my hand, a cold weight of responsibility. I wasn't a young patrolman anymore. My knees ached with every step on the slick concrete, but I kept moving. I saw the light spilling from the cracks of a corrugated metal boathouse at the end of the pier. A single black limousine was parked outside. Thorne's car. I moved to the side of the building, pressing my ear against the cold metal. Inside, the sound of the storm was muffled, replaced by the echo of voices. "The numbers don't lie, Richard, but people do." It was Thorne's voice, smooth, arrogant. I found a gap in the sliding door, just wide enough to see through. The scene inside was like a tableau from a nightmare. Arthur Hayes, the man I had interrogated, the man who had wept in my cell, was on his knees in the center of the room. His face was bruised, his glasses gone. He looked small and broken. Standing over him was Marcus Thorne, holding a silver-plated pistol. 2 of his hired muscles stood back by the shadows, arms crossed, but they weren't looking at Arthur. They were looking up at the catwalk that ran along the ceiling of the warehouse. Standing on the metal grating, 30 feet above them, was the other man. He looked identical to the man on his knees, but his posture was completely different. He stood straight, confident. He wore a crisp raincoat, dry and clean. In his hand he held a thick, leather-bound book. The ledger. "Let him go, Marcus," the man on the catwalk said. His voice was the one I heard on the phone. Cold, precise. "Come down, Richard," Thorne yelled up. "Give me the book and you both walk away. You have my word." Richard laughed. It was a dry, mathematical sound. "Your word is worth less than the paper this ledger is printed on. I've calculated the odds, Marcus. If I come down, the probability of survival for both of us drops to 0. What would you have done? Would you reveal yourself to save the hostage or wait for the perfect shot?" I finally understood the mechanics of the trick. It was elegant in its cruelty. Richard, the cold actuary, had found Arthur weeks ago. He had groomed his destitute twin, promised him money, maybe a fresh start. He used Arthur as a decoy. He sent Arthur to the office to be arrested at 8 p.m., knowing the police would pick him up for the embezzlement. While Arthur sat in my interrogation room, providing the perfect alibi of being in custody, the real Richard went to the office at 10:14 p.m. He made the call to his wife to establish a timeline contradiction. He wanted the police to be confused. He wanted us chasing ghosts and technical glitches while he retrieved the ledger from the vent and secured his getaway. The impossibility was just a smokescreen created by a man who treated people like numbers in an equation. "I'm tired of this," Thorne snapped. He cocked the hammer of his gun and pointed it at Arthur's head. I'm going to count to 3. If you don't drop that book, your brother dies. Arthur looked up, tears mixing with the blood on his face. Richard, please. Richard didn't move. He adjusted his grip on the ledger. He was calculating. He was weighing the value of the evidence against the value of his brother's life. 1, Thorne said. I saw Richard's eyes. They were dead. He wasn't going to come down. He was going to let Thorne pull the trigger, and then he was going to use the distraction to escape. To Richard, Arthur wasn't a brother. He was an expendable asset, a sunken cost. I couldn't wait any more. I kicked the rusted side door open. It banged loud against the metal wall, sounding like a gunshot. Police! Drop it, Thorne! The reaction was instantaneous. Thorne spun toward me, his gun swinging away from Arthur. The 2 hired thugs reached for their weapons, but Richard moved first. From the catwalk, he didn't help me. He didn't help Arthur. He saw his window of opportunity. He threw the heavy ledger, not at Thorne, but through the high warehouse window, shattering the glass. The book sailed out into the dark, rainy night, plummeting toward the ocean. No! Thorne screamed, distracted by the flight of his millions. If you were the detective, who would you shoot? The man with the gun, or the man getting away? I fired. My bullet didn't hit Thorne. I wasn't trying to kill him. I hit the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall next to him. The canister exploded in a cloud of white, chemical fog. Thorne coughed, stumbling back, blinding him and his men. Arthur, move! I shouted. Arthur scrambled on his hands and knees, rolling behind a stack of pallets. Gunfire erupted from the fog. Bullets pinged off the metal walls around me. I returned fire, keeping my head low, aiming for the muzzle flashes. Above us, footsteps clanged on the metal catwalk. Richard was running. He was heading for the roof access. He had sacrificed the ledger to save his own skin. Get the back door! Thorne yelled to his men. I saw a shadow lunge at me through the white mist. I pistol-whipped him, a sharp crack against a jawbone, and he went down. I pushed forward, grabbing Arthur by the collar of his jacket. Can you walk? I think so, he stammered. Go, run to the road. Don't look back. Arthur hesitated, looking up at the catwalk where his brother was disappearing. But Richard left you to die, I yelled, shoving him toward the exit. Go! Arthur stumbled out into the rain. I turned back to the warehouse. Thorne was wiping the powder from his eyes, raising his gun toward me. It's over, Thorne, I called out, taking cover behind a forklift. The book is in the sound. It's gone. You have nothing. Thorne stopped. He lowered his gun slowly. He looked at the broken window where his empire had just vanished into the tide. He knew I was right. Without the ledger, he was just a businessman. But if he killed a cop, he was a fugitive. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then we heard it. A sound from the roof, a slip, a frantic scrambling of shoes on wet metal, and then a scream. It was a long, terrifying wail that ended abruptly with a sickening thud on the concrete pier outside. I ran to the door. Thorne didn't try to stop me. He just stood there, defeated by the gravity of the situation. I stepped out into the storm. Lying in the wet asphalt, twisted at an unnatural angle, was Richard Hayes. He had tried to jump from the warehouse roof to the neighboring building to escape. He had miscalculated the friction of the wet roof. He was dead. I walked over to him. His eyes were open, staring up at the rain, his expression still frozen in that look of cold concentration. Thorne walked out behind me. He looked at the body, then at me. He dropped his gun on the ground. "I guess," Thorne said quietly. "He forgot to carry the one." The sirens were wailing in the distance now. Backup was coming. I looked at the dead man, and then I looked toward the road where Arthur had disappeared into the night. The impossible phone call, the locked room, the twins. It all unraveled into a simple, tragic story of greed. Richard Hayes thought he could outsmart everyone. He thought he could control every variable, but he forgot the one thing you can never calculate in a crime: nature. The rain doesn't care about your plans. The sirens finally arrived, cutting through the storm with wails that sounded like mourning. Blue and red lights swept across the wet pier, illuminating the rain in strobe light flashes. I stood by the body of Richard Hayes, watching the steam rise from the cooling asphalt. Marcus Thorne didn't fight when the uniforms cuffed him. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the dark water of the Puget Sound, where his leverage and his future had sunk beneath the waves. Without the ledger, he was vulnerable. Without Richard to cook the books, he was exposed. He looked smaller suddenly, just an old man in a wet silk robe, shivering in the cold. Sergeant Miller ran up to me, breathless, his raincoat flapping in the wind. He looked at the body of Richard, then at the handcuffed Thorne, and finally at me. "Jack," he panted, "we found the car. We found the gun. But where's the prisoner? Where's Hayes?" I lit a cigarette, shielding the flame with my cupped hand. The smoke tasted harsh, grounding me. I looked toward the road, into the deep darkness where Arthur had vanished. "Hayes is right there," I said, pointing to the dead man on the ground. Miller frowned, looking down at Richard. "No, I mean the one from the cell. The twin." I took a long drag. There was no twin, Miller. Just a confused man, a lot of shadows and a trick of the light. Richard Hayes is dead. Case closed. Miller stared at me for a long moment. He was a good cop, but he knew when not to ask questions. He saw the look in my eyes, the exhaustion, the finality. He nodded slowly. "Right," Miller said softly. "Case closed. What would you have done? Would you have hunted down the surviving brother or let him fade into the night? We never found the ledger. Police divers spent 3 days dragging the Sound, but the currents around Pier 59 are treacherous. It was gone, swallowed by the mud and the dark. But we didn't need it. Elena Hayes, the wife, came forward the next morning. Once she knew Richard was dead, and once she knew Thorne was in custody. She stopped being afraid. She didn't have the physical book, but she had something better. She had the memory of a woman who had watched her husband's corruption for 20 years. She knew where the bodies were buried, figuratively speaking. Her testimony put Marcus Thorne away for 15 years on racketeering and conspiracy charges. Thorne died in prison in 1989, heart failure, or maybe just a lack of control. As for Arthur, I never saw him again. He was a ghost before this started, and he became a ghost again. But about 6 months after the shooting, I received an envelope at the precinct, no return address, postmarked from a small town in Montana. Inside there was no letter, no note, just a single cashier's check for $50, the cost of the replacement glasses he had broken in the interrogation room, and a small torn piece of paper with a handwritten equation. 1 plus 0 force 1. He was telling me he was alone, that the other half of his equation was gone, and he was finally whole. I retired 2 years later. The damp of Seattle had gotten into my joints, and the darkness of the job had gotten into my head. I spent my time fishing, reading, and trying to forget the sound of ringing phones in empty rooms. But that case, it stays with me. It stays with me because of the voice. I still think about that moment in the office, holding the receiver, hearing Richard's voice so calm and precise, while his twin brother wept in my cell. Richard had turned his own brother into a recording. He had reduced a human being to a sound bite, a tool to be used and discarded. He thought he could script reality. He thought he could edit the world like a column of figures. But life isn't a ledger. It's messy. It's chaotic. It's rain on a roof and a slip of a shoe. Sometimes, late at night, when the rain is hammering against my window and the house is quiet, the phone will ring. Just a wrong number or a telemarketer. But for a split second before I pick it up, I hesitate. I wonder if I'll hear a voice that shouldn't be there. A voice from the past, trying to balance the books. I've seen a lot of bad things in this job. I've seen greed, anger, and madness. But nothing chilled me quite as much as the cold rationality of Richard Hayes. A man who was so obsessed with being in two places at once that he ended up in neither. That's the thing about echoes, detective. Eventually they fade. But the silence they leave behind? That lasts forever. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. The rain is letting up and my coffee is cold. If you enjoy these stories, if you like sitting in the dark and unraveling the threads of the past with an old detective, do me a favor, click that subscribe button. It's a small thing, but it tells me there are still people out there who want to hear the truth, no matter how strange it gets. Turn on the notifications so you don't miss the next file I pull from the archives. And what's the strangest case you ever heard of? I'd like to read your stories in the comments.